Welcome. In Westbridge, every notification carries a story. A simple message can change a life. And sometimes, love begins beyond the screen. Josh sent a random message in Westbridge. 5 years later, something he could not have imagined would settle into the town as if it had always belonged there. The sentence could have been an accident, or a kindness tossed into the small-town wind. It began with a plain thing. A folded note, a brown paper bag of a sandwich left on the reading table at Westbridge Public, a thermos of soup set against the stack of picture books. Whoever found it knew someone had been thinking of them that morning. Whoever noticed it felt less alone for an hour. For Tessa Marlow, who kept the library's calendar and its pocket of weekday quiet, that bag was a private message in a language she understood. Care, without strings. By the time she sat across from Josh Clark in the corner of the Westbridge Café, that bag belonged to memories she had not shared. He leaned forward, palms flat on the small round table, warm from the cup of chamomile tea he'd ordered to soothe a travel-sore throat. Outside, snow clung to the eaves of the pharmacy, and the pines smelled like clean smoke. Inside, the cafe hummed with the low baritone of a neighbor reciting the news aloud, a toddler tapping a spoon against a mug. "You're quieter than I expected," Josh said, watching Tessa as if he were cataloging the differences between how small towns look in photos and how they feel up close. He had the ease of someone used to making room for himself in different rooms. Glass-walled offices, flight lounges, reception halls, an effortless adjustment of posture when a space asked for it. His coat was practical, his hands careful, the hint of travel on him like sand on shoes. He was the kind of man who had learned how to be unobtrusive in 100 different places. Tessa folded the napkin in half and let the corner brush the table. She wore a wool coat that had held 6 seasons too many, and a scarf knitted by her mother with one loose stitch that she found comforting. Her hair was pulled back with a pencil. Her face, which had learned to smile without giving too much away, softened now when she spoke about the library's story hour. There was a small freckle near her left eyebrow that moved when she laughed. And when she laughed, the freckle shifted as though it were trying to keep pace. "You came a long way," she said. "You sure you remember how to read to a 4-year-old? They can be brutal critics." He smiled, and for a second, the room narrowed to that smile and the safe place it seemed to carve in the air. "I think I can manage. What I need to know is, do they accept the same terrible animal voices I practiced in my 20s? Laya, who sat on Tessa's knee with one sock missing and the other decorated with tiny unicorns, declared in no uncertain terms that polar bears deserved a deep, terrible voice. She demonstrated. Tessa's eyes softened and then shifted. The past has a way of arriving in small, misaligned pieces. Voices, gestures, the tilt of someone's jaw. When Laya's bare foot landed against Josh's knee, he did not startle. He reached out as if to steady the child and then froze as recognition did not bloom but settled into his face like a photograph developed too slowly. He blinked. He remembered the town. He did not remember the name. Then, "You're the one with the lunches," Tessa said, and she watched him watch the word settle. Josh's brow moved. "Excuse me? You used to leave things," she added, carefully casual, as if testing the water. "Years ago, for whoever came in on empty days. Sandwiches, sometimes soup, a thermos. The kids would find them. I remember the notes, for whoever needs a warm hand today. And they were anonymous. We all wondered who would do that." He laughed softly, and it was a laugh that had been polished by time. "I think you have me mixed up with a saint. I grew up downriver from here. My life has been mostly other people's mail and spreadsheets." The way she looked at him then was not accusing so much as anchored. "You were a kid here," she said. "Maybe not the same kid, but—" She nodded toward Laya, who was now insisting on reading an illustrated book with no regard for the order of pages. "You sat by the children's table sometimes. You smelled like winter and peanut butter. You left lunch in the early afternoon sometimes. Maybe your face is different." Embarrassment flickered across his features like a brief cloud. He shifted, and the lamplight caught in his hair. Something private nudged his mouth into a crooked smile. "Then I guess I'm guilty of being a vague benefactor." He said it as one might confess to a minor transgression on a road trip, pleasantly amused, slightly apologetic. "But I promise you, if I did that, I was probably trying to be less lonely than generous." Tessa's laugh had a brittle edge that didn't reach her eyes. "That's a familiar motive," she said. "We allow that in kids." They spoke of small things, shelf markers, the new bench the PTA had installed, how the snow made the town's conifers look like private caskets of white. Between such exchanges, they skirted the deeper reasons they'd ended up at a table together. The date had been arranged by someone who knew both of them, a mutual friend from a book club, a little nudge. Neither sibling's presence felt like a collision. It felt like two scripts that might be rearranged to find a new cadence. Josh, who had flown back because the meeting was supposed to be civil and brief, a courtesy call between strangers, found himself asking about the library's hours, about the story hour, about whether the children liked dinosaurs or princesses. There was the tremor of real curiosity in him. He listened not as a man tallying opportunities, but as someone eager to be taught small rituals he had missed. After the cafe, the three of them walked the block to the library, because it felt reasonable to test the fit of the conversation against the brick and ivy room where Tessa's life was mostly housed. The library smelled like rain-damp paper and lemon oil, and the narrow hallways carried the muffled sound of an elderly volunteer humming along with the radio. Tessa moved like she belonged to the building, pulling open an old wooden window to let in the alley's cold, arranging a chair for Laya that always held straw from the playground, writing a crooked globe. Josh wandered between the stacks with the kind of prolonged attention he gave to other people's charities when he had time off from board meetings. His fingers brushed titles as if reading the spines told him more than the jacket did. "I used to sit in the corner near the children's section," he said, half to the books and half to Tessa. "I liked the quiet. Sometimes it was easier than home." "You made lunches and left them on the table," Tessa repeated, softer, as if sharing a secret with a place rather than a man. "You never came forward. You didn't want to be seen." He didn't meet her gaze at that. He was used to being visible. Someone else's choice to anonymize a kindness felt foreign to his usual directness. "Maybe I was a coward." He smiled then, a smaller, more honest thing. Or it felt more honest that way. Something about not tying expectation to generosity. The library's back window fogged from the heat and the cold. Laya, who had been given permission to climb the little wooden dinosaur display, insisted that dinosaurs enjoyed chamomile tea too. She leaned against Josh, trusting as only small children are capable of trusting, and for a moment he looked less like a negotiator and more like a man who remembered what being kept safe had once felt like. Tessa watched with the mixture of caution and relief she reserved for strangers, who might actually become less intrusive. They strolled back out into the early afternoon, as snowlight turned the town into a place that could be mistaken for a postcard. On the library counter, a white envelope sat where the old fines shelf met the circulation desk. A notice peeked from it. Final notice. Someone had left it in the breeze. Tessa picked it up without looking, the movement of fingers folding like a reflex. "Our utilities were cut last month," she said into her scarf, as if naming it might make it go away. She showed him the envelope, and the polite, stubborn handwriting that didn't belong to a bank, but to the paper's formal insistence. "They give us a month, then they send for more. It's—" She stopped, gave the budgeted smile she kept like a talisman. "It's managed." Josh watched her. He had not come to Westbridge to buy anyone's gratitude, and he had learned, behind glass doors and in meeting rooms that hummed like beehives, the difference between giving and deciding. The line between help and takeover is narrower than most people expect. Pride is a thing that must be preserved carefully when someone offers a bridge. "Would it help if I—" he started. His voice sounded like a man learning the contours of a delicate object by touch. He was used to saying with corporate language, "We'll invest, we'll partner, we'll save." Here the verbs felt awkward. Tessa shook her head like an old radio station clearing. "People come through for us when they see a crisis, but it leaves a mark. I need the library to be ours, not theirs. We can take loans or grants, but public perception. Something about the idea of outsiders saving Westbridge brings more scrutiny than help." It was not refusal. It was a boundary set on principle, a way to keep the small apartment they called home, to keep the dignity connected to their work, and not to relief. Josh listened with that measured patience of someone who'd had many people say no to him in polished boardrooms. "I understand," he said. "It's important the community keeps ownership. She let the sentence stand there like a small, hard thing held between two palms. Tessa had learned that allowing a gesture to be accepted on her terms was worth waiting for. She did not ask for what she needed because every ask could be dredged up another way. When the conversation shifted to lighter things, the carvings on the new bench, the way the town's post office still used stamps bearing the old mayor's face, Josh joked about the terrible animal voices he could make. Laya demanded that he demonstrate. He obliged. And for a while the town was just a small theater of magic. A man who knew the names of corporations forming silly noises for a child who believed in dragons. A few days later, when the rain had turned to a hard, clean sheen on the pavement, a random message arrived on Tessa's phone. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. A simple line, "See you at the Saturday reading." It could have been a mistaken number from a neighbor. She almost dismissed it. Instead, she forwarded it to the library's group chat with a small shrug of digital confetti. Someone answered, "He's back," jokingly. And someone else replied with the new calendar link. The message was incidental. It was the kind of small, unimportant coordination that keeps town institutions alive. It held nothing of the weight of promises. But for Josh, who had sent it late the night before from a hotel room on the edge of town, half a courtesy, half an experiment. It was the first non-business communication he had started in months. He hadn't expected it to be the beginning of anything. It was, in his own words later, random. If you wanted to make the beginning feel inevitable, you could point to details. The way he'd kept one of the sandwiches he'd once left in his memory as an inexplicable tenderness. The fact that his childhood in Westbridge had been a patchwork of other people's kindnesses. The way the town kept its hours measured by the library clock. But beginnings are rarely tidy. They look ordinary until you look again. A soft CTA in the middle of something like this risks sounding like an interruption. So it was placed with care. If this moment pulls at you, tap the like button and stay with the story. There are more small things that change lives than most of us notice. After the reading that Saturday, when Josh performed a particularly dramatic penguin voice that made the children gasp and then dissolve into applause, Tessa walked him out. The sky had turned the color of old pewter, and the street lamps blinked awake. The town had that low, contented murmur that happens when everyone has had enough soup and conversation to last until bedtime. "You left lunches," she said again, for the sake of naming the past. "I remember the handwriting on the notes. Sometimes you'd leave a small card, sometimes a strip of newspaper that smelled of peanut butter." He looked at the ground, then at the library's door, then at her. "Maybe I left things because I wanted to see who would find them. Maybe I wanted to believe that the world was full of hands." There was a tenderness in his voice that was not theatrical. It was the voice of someone who had learned late how to be quiet with other people's scarcity. He had wealth now, yes, an accumulation that made other people's problems administratively solvable. But those ledgers did not erase the private architecture of need. He had learned that money could open doors, but could not always knock at the right time. That evening, as he drove back to the hotel on the ridge above Westbridge, the town pooling under him like an open palm, he felt oddly dislodged from his habitual anonymity. The feeling was quiet, a resonance, like the echo of footsteps in an empty room. And he kept thinking of the small white envelope with the final notice that had sat on the library counter. In Westbridge, seasons mattered in the way people came to know each other. The spring reading festival arrived with paper fans and lemonade stands. The summer brought a lending program for gardening tools. The fall saw the children's shelves expand. The winter arrived with its own economy. Soup, scarves, the quiet collection of community stories. Tessa went home to an apartment that was 2 floors above a bakery and had one good window. It was modest. A rusted radiator that kept heat by protest. A bookshelf with more stamped cards than recent titles. And a small corner where Laya did her homework under the promise of a nightlight shaped like a moon. Tessa's life was threaded with the sort of disciplined improvisation that parents invent. Canned beans paired with fresh greens, story hours balanced with late-night lesson prep, a stubborn refusal to accept anything that felt like charity. On a Tuesday evening, Laya came down with a fever that climbed as if testing the night's patience. It started with a nap that stretched too long, and ended with a small face burning and a sleep that was not restful. Tessa took the child's temperature and watched the numbers climb. A maternal alarm flickered through her like a warning light. When you have a child, you learn the arithmetic of fear quickly. how 1 degree can mean a change in the variables. By the time they reached the hospital, Laya's cheeks were lacquered with heat, her breaths shallow and quick. The emergency room at Westbridge General had a practical calm to it. Fluorescent lights softened by plastic plants, posters about vaccinations with patient cartoons, a rotating sign of waiting times on a battered TV screen. The triage nurse took Laya's vitals with a gentle efficiency, asking the questions that had an authority Tessa found both relieving and invasive. When someone asked about allergies, Tessa felt like she was reciting facts off a child's medical resume. "You can go back with her," the nurse said. "We'll start an IV if she needs fluids, keep her warm, check for any obvious infections." Josh arrived as Tessa was filling out forms on the clipboard with the infection control policies printed in stern type. He had been driving with a focused urgency, the kind of rapid calm that seems instinctive in people who are used to solving problems quickly. He had called as soon as she texted him at the mention of a fever, and that call was the kind of small, practical thing he did not broadcast: an offer to drive, a question about whether she preferred chamomile in the waiting room. He sat in the plastic chair across from them with his palm over his mouth like a handguard. There is a peculiar intimacy to being with someone in an emergency. You are both an anchor and a witness. Josh did not hover. He stepped into the room with a measured presence that said, in the most unobtrusive way possible, "I will be here." The doctor, young, more practical than theatrical, examined Laya with the brisk kindness of someone who had seen small humans run through many fevered storms. There was an IV placed, an order for blood work, and the careful language of provisional diagnoses. "Febrile seizure risk is low," the doctor said, which is both a relief and a caveat. They observed, they monitored, they turned the medical machinery of local hospitals into something less opaque by translating the steps out loud. Sitting by the bed, Tessa was meticulous with details: the way the blanket brushed Laya's chin, the position of her stuffed rabbit, the slight tremor in the child's hands that had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with being somewhere that smelled like antiseptic. She felt the old, familiar press of fear in her chest, not the kind that leaves you breathless for hours, but the sort that makes your hands steady, but your thoughts sharp. "I don't know how you feel about hospital gowns," Josh said quietly, attempting to be steady for both of them. "But if you need coffee, there's a machine in the lobby, and if you need me to talk to anyone, doctors, nurses, I can." Her jaw tightened around a sentence. "Thank you," she said. Her gratitude had the economy of someone who seldom accepted things without taking a small measure of what they gave in return. The night wore into a sparse congregation of fluorescent time. Laya slept, deep, occasionally flowering with a small moan that chased Tessa to the bedside. The doctor's rounds were efficient. The nurse checked the IV with the care of someone who knew how small hands could be talented at finding trouble. A resident physician took a swab, and the waiting that lived between lab work and results felt like a stretched elastic band that could snap into relief or pull them toward deeper concern. At 2 a.m., when the nurse brought Tessa a paper cup of tepid coffee, a man in a raincoat stood in the doorway with a presence that made the air tilt. He looked like someone used to being late everywhere except for the moments that mattered. He introduced himself with a clipped apology. "Ms. Marlow?" he asked, and the envelope he held was the kind lawyers habitually carry, folded, heavy with intent. Tessa's hand tightened around the cup until her knuckles blanched. There is nothing like the sound of your name said with officialness to make your body remember the sound of every hard year. "Yes," she said, voice steady because the body knows how to produce a voice when necessary. The man, slick, smooth, with the meander of someone accustomed to extracting concessions, sat down without asking and laid out paperwork that smelled faintly of expensive ink. "Mr. Derek Ames," he said. "He will be filing a petition for custody. He wished to serve you as soon as possible." The words landed like small stones. Tessa's mind catalogued. Derek, absent until now, an ex who had a history of promises he never kept, who had left town with a suitcase and a phone that never answered. Derek, who had not attended a single parent-teacher conference, now read like a man returned from a long trip, determined to claim something that had been left unprotected. The hospital room shrank around the fact that her child's vulnerability and her legal vulnerability might coincide. "You can't be serious," she said, "because it is a polite way to ask the universe to check itself." The lawyer's face held no compassion. His efficiency had an edge that felt like a blade. "The law looks at permits and petitions," he said. "He's served the notice. We have affidavits, Ms. Marlow. Absence is not an absolute bar to rights. We intend to file for temporary custody for review." Temporary custody are technical words that translate in life to, "This may change where your child sleeps tonight." They are an architecture of legal momentum. A courthouse has a way of turning a moment into a calendar. Tessa's breath hitched. Laya stirred, a small child's habit of being sensitive to voices. Josh put out a hand, not to block the paper, but to steady the air so that the encounter would not explode into something larger. "This is not the moment to do this," he said evenly. "You should have contacted Ms. Marlow privately if you had concerns." It was not a legal argument. He was not yet invoking the language of courts. He was pointing out the human decency of timing. The lawyer touched the envelope as if it contained a larger property than papers. "Mr. Ames is within his rights to act," he said. "Given Ms. Marlow's current—" "A child in a hospital bed?" Josh cut in. "Please." The exchange bent into a fragile choreography. Legal language on one side, small human panic on the other. Tessa was practiced in hiding panic from Laya. She did not want to make tonight any larger than necessary. She folded her hands under the blanket and let the small weight of the IV pole anchor her. "You can't take her," she whispered, though she did not know if she meant the child or the life she had stitched together. "You can't just take what I've built while I'm trying to be the one who cares for her." The lawyer's expression was an obliging mask. "We're simply filing for temporary custody pending review," he said, the words carefully neutral as if he were describing weather. "This is standard procedure." A nurse interposed herself, professional and kindly, and shifted conversation with the deftness of someone balancing a dozen human frailties. She informed them the lab results would arrive within the hour, that the fever would be monitored, that a pediatrician on call would consult soon. But the legal blot had been placed on the page, and Tessa felt its ink seeping into her night. Josh's mind, which had a habit of thinking in terms of schedules and contracts and the logistics of ease, started to imagine paperwork the way he imagined spreadsheets, rows of need, columns of liability. He had the resources to hire counsel, to make sure a petition was met with evidence of absence and proof of parenting. But money does not settle the question of dignity. It can, at best, buy time. It can rarely purchase the quiet of agency. He told the lawyer in a tone that was less an accusation than a declarative. "We will need to make sure any petition is matched against presence. Mr. Ames has been absent." He did not say, "I will pay for this." He said instead, "We will ensure the child's welfare is foregrounded." Tessa watched the back and forth with a reserve that had been built by necessity. She had a file at home with pay stubs, a roster of volunteers, notes from school teachers about Laya's progress, receipts for the pediatrician visit she managed on her own. All of it was the quiet labor of a parent who kept records like armor. She felt the room aligning itself into opposing vectors, legal motion on one side and caring presence on the other. When the pediatrician arrived and scanned the file, and when Laya's fever began its slow decline under the attention of saline and careful monitoring, Tessa let out a breath like a person who had held aside a storm with a thin sheet. The relief was not total. The legal notice had been served, and the knowledge of a pending petition sat like a new notch of worry. The hospital corridor had a different smell at dawn. Coffee, disinfectant, the sweet, persistent odor of overnight. Josh sat in the plastic chair again after a long stretch of silence and watched Tessa as she rested, jaw slack, eyes rimmed in the smallest shadow. He respected the boundaries she had set. That assistance had to be in the form she accepted, not in any grand gesture. Over the next days, he moved with an economy that sought to be invisible. He contacted a lawyer, quietly, and asked for counsel who could respond with sensitivity and respect for Tessa's autonomy. He asked professionals he trusted, people who did not do the scene, who crafted clauses and instruments that respected agency, to prepare for what might become a contested custody case. The mechanism he described was precise: a trust, properly notarized and structured for the child's education and medical needs, with a clause that allowed counsel to act on Laya's behalf without public fanfare. He wanted an instrument that protected rather than paraded, but he did not propose to take control. He proposed to lubricate the legal machinery in a way that preserved Tessa's rights. He asked for a local attorney, one who understood Westbridge judges and the town's rhythms, because he knew that what would persuade a judge was not the size of a bank account, but evidence of presence, of the parent's role in the child's life, of community ties. He wanted to create a buffer that would enable Tessa to retain custody if the law looked at the facts. Tessa listened to part of it. The language of trusts made her think of far-off institutions and gates. She resisted being grateful for a check placed on her kitchen table. She wanted a mechanism that would empower her rather than make her feel beholden. There is a peculiar pride in accepting help that is set up so you can keep your life, not so you must live by someone else's terms. She asked for time. Mostly she asked to be included in decisions, to have counsel who spoke not in directives but in options. If a legal instrument was to be placed on Laya's behalf, she wanted to be part of the drafting. She did not want an anonymous savior placing a boat in her river without consulting the current. Josh agreed. He did more than agree. He insisted. It was not a show of generosity for the cameras, no press releases, no gala donations. He asked his people to construct a trust that was narrow, specific, governed by Westbridge Council, with a children's advocate named as the trustee in case of emergency. He asked for documents that a judge could respect. Timelines of presence, affidavits from neighbors, proof of parental engagement. He wanted to protect, not possess. The next chapter in this unfolding night was yet to be written, and the town of Westbridge moved with its usual mix of gossip and kindness. In the bakery, people said quietly, "Poor Tessa," and then pinned a casserole or a watchful eye to the evening. Monsieur Jameson, the neighbor who tended the municipal garden, offered to dog-sit if the courts asked for any oversight. The library volunteers compiled a packet of attendance sheets and story-hour photos that would show, in simple human terms, that Laya's world had remained anchored. On the third day after the hospital visit, Tessa sat at her kitchen table with a folder of papers that felt more like armor than pleading. She had the small print of receipts, a log of medications, notes from community volunteers, and a list of people who could attest that she had not only been present, but actively engaged in Laya's life. She had, over the years, done what parents do: collected the modest evidence of commitment. At the same time, a legal representative for Derek had filed a motion and served notice. The court date would come sooner than most municipal calendars. The prospect of moving through it felt like navigating a narrow boat in rough weather. She watered the spider plant that sat by the sink until its leaves glowed, grounding herself in the domestic ritual of care. Josh, who by then had toggled his influence into discreet channels, sat across from Tessa's kitchen table. He had brought nothing flashy, no envelopes tossed on counters, no spectacle of help. He brought a printed copy of a retainer and a list of suggested local councils who had reputations for sensitivity. He offered nothing that removed Tessa's agency. He offered means to buy time and representation. "You never asked for any of this," he said when she paused on the third intake of breath, the one that organizes itself before a person steps forward. "But I'm not going to let them try to take Laya based on paperwork and timing. I want to make sure you have someone who will present the facts, your presence, the teachers, the volunteers." She looked at him, truly looked, and in her face he read a complicated ledger. Gratitude offset by the resistance born of knowing what it had felt like to be made small by the charity of others. "I appreciate it," she said finally. It was not a full acceptance. It was not a concession. It was the precise note of someone who knows the cost of surrender and the value of autonomy. The story was not yet resolved. There would be hearings, affidavits, a medical follow-up, months that felt both speeded up and endless. For now, what remained was this: a man who had sent a random message once, an anonymous sandwich left at a library table, had returned to the town he left behind and, almost accidentally, stepped into the fragile architecture of someone else's life. His presence was a kind of weather, and what it would do remained to be seen. As the town turned its everyday engines, school buses, bake sales, a municipal meeting about replacing broken street lamps, an angular thing caught at the edges of the narrative. A sense that small acts carry weight, that kindnesses left anonymously can become a language later named in a courtroom, a hospital, or a kitchen. Tessa folded the legal papers and put them, for the moment, in a drawer that also held her tax slips and Laya's birth certificate. Outside, the snow began again, muffling the street and bending the town into a private, reflective place. The small town of Westbridge settled into its rhythms as if nothing had shifted, and yet everything had. The first random message had been a small mechanics of mercy. Now the machinery of law and health had engaged, and the outcome would depend on many things: evidence and compassion, presence and process, the ability of a community to remember. In a hotel room 2 towns over, Josh lay awake and reread the text he had sent the week before. The random message that began less as a plan and more as a thread. He did not know yet whether the trust he had initiated would bind into the right kind of support, or whether his interventions would be welcomed or resented. He did not know either whether his presence would stir something in Tessa that belonged to them or to the space between them. He only knew that his small acts had elastic consequences, and that he had sent a message into the town that, 5 years from now, would look like a different weather. The night held its breath. The story, like a book left open on a table, awaited the next hand to turn the page. The town did not rush to pass judgment on that cold night. It folded the news into its small rituals and went about making casseroles and offers to babysit. But law moves on its own clock, and soon there was a calendar stamped with a hearing date that made the days ahead feel crowded. They began with the practical things: affidavits and attendance logs, school notes and story hour photos. Tessa and Josh sat at her kitchen table in the middle of a gray week, shuffling the pages into neat stacks. The local attorney Josh had suggested, Marta Rivera, a woman with kind eyes and the gait of someone used to carrying other people's burdens without dramatic speeches, went through each item with the care of someone restoring an old book. She asked questions that made Tessa think of small, measurable facts. Dates when Laya had attended programs, volunteer logs with signatures, emails from teachers who could speak to parenting that was present every day. Tessa insisted on being the author of the narrative. She chose the photographs that would accompany the affidavit, the notes that would explain the empty nights she'd worked to juggle shifts. She refused to be presented as a passive recipient of another's narrative. When Marta suggested a public relations approach, arranging a local op-ed to sway community sentiment, Tessa rejected it outright. "This isn't about a story," she said. "This is about a life. If people know us because they know us, that's enough." Josh watched this with a mixture of admiration and humility. He learned to sit in the quiet place at the edge of another person's work, offering logistical support, but not filling the room with himself. He paid for an expert witness who could testify about custody standards and the importance of routine, and he retained a local investigator to compile records demonstrating Derek Ames's absence. A long trail of missed visits, unpaid child support filings unreconciled, phone records that showed months of silence. The investigator's report was a blunt, embarrassing ledger for Derek, but it was the kind of evidence a judge is trained to parse. Yet the most persuasive things in family court are rarely spreadsheets. They are the small, steady acts that make a life coherent. A mother's ability to find bandages at midnight, a neighbor's testimony about who tucks in a child when the parents work late, a classroom teacher's note about a child's robust, affectionate connection to one adult. Tessa collected those facts like a gardener gathers cuttings to start a new row. There were motions, formal requests, deadlines, responses. Derek's counsel filed for temporary custody. Marta countered with a motion to dismiss, arguing lack of substantial connection and alleging procedural fishing by an absent father with an opportunistic motive. There were discovery requests that threatened to drag private details into the public corridor of the courthouse. Marta negotiated them with an eye toward preserving Tessa's privacy, pushing back where press fodder would do harm. She arranged for the guardian ad litem, an impartial advocate the court often appoints in contested custody cases, to visit the home, speak with Laya and with Tessa, and report back on the child's best interests. The visit was a small, tender crisis averted. The guardian ad litem, a woman named Claire, arrived on a wind-bright morning with sensible shoes and a notebook. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, while Laya showed off a game of make-believe and a drawing where the sun wore a smile. Claire noted the way Tessa read with a practiced patience, the way she coaxed a shy answer from a child who still had the little gaps of home in her speech. Her report, drafted with professional neutrality, would become one of the quiet pillars of the case. In the week before the hearing, the hospital follow-ups concluded with good news. Laya's fever had been a severe but temporary episode, managed and monitored, and the pediatrician gave them a letter that summarized the treatment. It was clinical, concise, and, when added to the pile of documentation, useful in demonstrating that the child had been appropriately cared for at every turn. What complicated proceedings cannot erase is the way the human heart reckons with being seen. The court docket sits on one plane. On another, people gather casseroles and send texts. M. Jameson, who tended the municipal garden and ran the local youth basketball teams, compiled affidavits from volunteers who had watched Tessa in the small work of daily caregiving. The bakers left pies on the library steps with notes that said simply, "We know who you are." These were not legal arguments, but in a town where the judge knew more than one volunteer by name, community sentiment could become persuading texture rather than merely noise. The morning of the hearing, Westbridge's county courthouse wore its layer of ordinary dignity. Brass door handles warmed by a thin sun, a flag outside that hung limp as if exhausted by weather and duty. The courtroom itself was modest. A bench, a handful of chairs, a wooden rail separating audience from procedure. Tessa arrived with Marta and a folder of documents, Leia in tow, wearing the practical clothes of a child who lived a life undisturbed by theatrical gestures. Derek arrived with his lawyer, the air around him restless as a man who had been late to his own consequences. Judge Holloway, small, square, a judge whose voice had the practiced neutrality of rain, listened as both sides presented their cases. Derek's counsel painted a picture of fatherly rights. They argued that the court should consider visitation and, pending a fuller hearing, provisional custody might be appropriate. Marta's response was steady. Present evidence of Tessa's continual involvement, emphasize Derek's prolonged absence, and highlight the child's strong ties to the home and to school. She asked the court to apply the standard most judges defer to with care: the best interest of the child. In family law, best interest is a constellation of factors: emotional ties, stability, parental fitness, the child's adjustment to home and community, and, critically, the practical reality of who has spent the past months and years in the trenches. Marta systematically offered witnesses: a teacher who could speak to Leia's attachment to the classroom, Claire the guardian ad litem who had recommended continued residence with Tessa, and a neighbor who could testify to the parents' presence during after-school hours. Each testimony was an account of presence. They did not need to be dramatic. They only needed to be real. Derek's presence in court, when his turn came, had the hollow sheen of an idea rather than a relationship. He read from a prepared statement about wanting to reconnect and do right by his daughter, but his phrases lacked the specificity that would make a judge place a child's life on new foundations. Marta's cross-examination was not theatrical. She asked quiet, precise questions about the dates of his last visits, about his capacity to provide stability, about the suddenness of his petition. The answers, when they came, were circled with uncertainty and scratches of absence. There was also, quietly arranged and presented, the legal instrument Josh had insisted on. Not a headline-making donation, but a structured assurance. Instead of a check handed over in open court, Marta presented a declaration from a local trust administrator, an independent nonprofit that managed donor-advised funds, confirming that funds had been placed in a child-specific account to cover educational and medical needs, should anything be required. The documents named a local children's advocate as the trustee, someone with no controlling interest in Tessa's life, and specified that the funds were conditional to be used for Leia's welfare only under the trustee's oversight in concert with court direction if necessary. The declaration avoided naming the settlor publicly. It was a legally sound instrument showing resources existed without turning the case into a spectacle of wealth. The judge reviewed the filings and listened to arguments with the patience of someone reading small print aloud. He asked questions one at a time, his voice slow and careful, and his focus eventually narrowed to the central matter. Who had been doing the daily work of raising this child? The answer, in a stack of documents and a set of human testimonies, was clear. Judge Holloway denied the motion for temporary custody and set the case for a later hearing with instructions aimed at safeguarding the child's routine while allowing both parents to be assessed over time. He affirmed that any financial instruments would be considered in the context of Leia's best interest, but would not, on their own, be grounds for altering custodial arrangements. It was a decision that preserved the status quo and the life Tessa had painstakingly built. For now, the child would remain in her mother's care. The judge ordered a visitation schedule to be explored only if Derek could demonstrate a sustained connection and capacity for stability. There was no grand exoneration of Derek, no moral sermon. The result felt like the slow, sensible breath of a community balancing law and care. Tessa wept once in the courthouse lobby, a short, raw thing, and then folded herself into the ordinary motions of home. She thanked Marta softly, and then stepped outside into a late winter that felt softer somehow, as if the town's wind had shifted direction. The weeks that followed were not marked by dramatic change, so much as by quieter stabilization. The trustee account was formalized through the local nonprofit. Tessa insisted on reading every line of the agreement, and chose the trustee herself, a retired school counselor known for discretion and an enduring commitment to children. The agreement allowed for payments for schooling, emergency medical costs, and occasional enrichment programs. But it required the trustee to consult with Tessa and to avoid unilateral decisions that would displace parent-led choices. The purpose, in Tessa's words, was to make sure that help arrived without making her life an exchange. Josh visited often enough to be familiar, never insistent, and sometimes not at all when his work required. He rented a modest office above the old mill, and over time, used it as a satellite base. It was not a mansion or a monument, just a simple room with a desk and a filing cabinet where he could balance Westbridge's rhythms with his own life. He donated through the trustee, channeled improvements to the library through the town's nonprofit board, and worked with volunteers to create an after-school program that employed local high school students as mentors. The grant money paid for extra staff stipends and a new heater for the children's wing, for carpets that children could sprawl on, and for a small science kit, prominently labeled, "For Curiosity." This process honored Tessa's boundary. The money arrived via channels she approved, and she retained a say in how it was used. The program bore her name quietly in the grant paperwork, but publicly stood for the town. It was Westbridge After School, not the Clark Foundation for Children. That distinction mattered. It preserved the dignity she had fought to keep. Life, in that mellow, patient way that small towns know, resumed. There were playdates and dentist appointments, bake sales and council meetings. Laya learned to tie her shoes. She outgrew the unicorn sock phase and moved on to a fascination with eclipses. Tessa's nights still carried the small measurements of worry. But she had company now. Friends who checked in, neighbors who dropped by with soup, a library calendar filled with regular helpers. The library opened a Saturday program on literacy and gardening, and Monsieur Jameson ran an adjacent seed swap that became, oddly, one of the town's most sociable rituals. There were awkward moments. Derek sent a letter through his lawyer that proposed a gradual visitation plan. Tessa agreed to supervised visits if they were arranged with careful terms and after demonstration of parental commitment. She did not want to punish a child with adult conflicts. She wanted adults to be accountable. Over time, Derek's efforts to reconnect were halting and uneven. He came to 2 supervised sessions, offered gifts that had more the odor of performative glamour than of steady parenting, and then faded again into silence. The court eventually closed the matter with an order that visitation could be revisited if he proved sustained involvement in the child's life. No dramatic rupture, no cinematic reconciliation, just the real work of a father, either choosing to parent or not. Josh and Tessa found a rhythm that respected both the smallness of their town and the complexity of their lives. He did not extinguish the hard parts of her life. He helped rearrange the furniture so they fit better. They ate together sometimes. He helped rewire a lamp in the library and joked about failing at gardening with M. Jameson. He read to children who preferred to be read to in penguin voices. The community came to expect his steady, quiet reliability without the fanfare he could have orchestrated. He learned how to ask for nothing in return, sometimes hard for a man used to lobbying for influence, and to let presence be his currency. Years, as they do, unfolded quietly. The children's wing expanded with the non-profit funds, a steady patchwork of donations coordinated so that no one large name overshadowed the town's contribution. A plaque was installed in the library's children's reading corner that read simply, "For the small kindnesses that ripple outward." It did not name a donor. It named a practice. Slow days turned into a mosaic of ordinary miracles. Laya's first lost tooth, and the small triumph of a recital, where she danced in a crown of tinsel, and the universe of a 4-year-old's imagination, stretched into a confident 9-year-old's friendship cluster. Tessa took a part-time position coordinating story-hour schedules for nearby districts and supplemented her income with evening shifts at the bakery below her apartment. Her pride was undimmed. She moved with the surety of someone who had rebuilt not by being rescued, but by accepting help on her own terms. 5 years after the random message that had begun as a small experiment in reaching out, Westbridge held a modest dedication for the new children's wing. The room smelled of fresh paint and new paperbacks. The windows let in an honest sun that fell across tiny tables with chairs the size of held promises. The town showed up with casseroles and bouquets, and a contingent from the school board who had watched the provincial politics of library funding for a decade. There were speeches that were small and serious. People told short, sincere stories about who had taught whom to read, and about the peculiar ways kindness worked in a town where everyone knew each other's birthdays. During the dedication, the trustee stood and read a short statement about how community funds had been marshaled to support literacy, how an anonymous benefactor had contributed to seed the program, and how the committee had intentionally kept the donation anonymous at the donor's request. There was no drama in this announcement, no unveiling, no camera flash. It was, by design, a matter-of-fact acknowledgement. Money came, it was used to expand access, and the town would continue the work. After the ribbon was cut and the children swarmed to the new shelves, Josh and Tessa found a bench near the back of the room. Laya, older now and more composed, was shelving books with neighbors and laughing with a friend about a story they had read. Tessa's hands had a faint proofreader's ink under the nails from organizing volunteer schedules. She looked tired and content in the way people do when they've earned their rest. Josh reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, plain ring. It was not a flourish of diamonds or a crafted promise of perfection. It was a band with the natural tiny marks of an object made to be worn and lived in. He took her hand, not with a dramatized gesture, but with the carefulness of someone who had learned how to hold lightly. "Tessa," he said, and there was a pause where the town hummed around them like a familiar tune. "I brought this for you. It's not a demand or a contract. It's a thing to say I intend to be here, if you want me to be." She looked at the band, at his face, at the quiet around them. It was the sort of question that asked for patient, adult reflection. She had been given many options over the years, rescue and the offer to be saved, but this was different. He had asked her how she wanted to be helped. He had listened. He had stayed. That had value that no checkbook could buy. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. She did not speak out of a script. Instead, she placed her hand on the bench in a way that made the gesture an answer in itself. "I will let you in, but I won't let you run my life. We will be a who, together, if and when that works. And we will always keep Laya's life first." Laya, who had been listening from across the room, bounded over and announced to no one and everyone, "Mom, Josh is giving you a ring. Is it sparkly?" The way she said it, candid, owner of the moment, made everyone laugh. Tessa pulled the child into a hug, and Josh, with the small improvisational grace he'd learned in Westbridge, laughed along at the right quiet moment. The town continued to make room for them in its steady, non-spectacular way. Josh kept his satellite office and started a lunch and learn program that hired a few local coordinators. The after-school programs expanded and branched into summer camps that were staffed by young people from Westbridge who had once scrambled for money to attend college. The trust remained a quiet safety net, used sparingly and transparently, under the trustee's supervision and with Tessa's consent. Sometimes, on nights when Westbridge lay under a bowl of fog and the library's windows glowed like watchful eyes, Josh would remember the small act he'd once made, an anonymous sandwich on a table, and the extraordinary architecture of consequences it had helped create. He did not think himself a hero. He thought about the many small decisions that had to line up. His decision to show up at the cafe, Tessa's decision to accept help on terms she set, Marta's careful counsel, Jameson's practical kindnesses. It was not a single dramatic saving. It was, rather, the accumulation of small promises kept. The ring on Tessa's finger was a symbol, nothing more, and everything else they had. It was a choice to be present. The library plaque, for the small kindnesses that ripple outward, became, in town lore, a shorthand memory for nights like that first frail hospital night, and the slow work that followed. Years later, when children asked why the children's wing had no donor's name, and why the plaque read as it did, Tessa would take them to the low reading nook and tell them about someone who once sent a small message to see who might show up. She would say simply that the best help is the help that listens, and that we could all do better if we asked how to assist without taking over. Josh, when asked by neighbors why he had stayed, would say the truth, that a town's claims on a person are not paid by money alone, but by willingness to be ordinary, to put down roots without expectation. He would shrug at the modesty of it, and then lean into a conversation about a new children's program, with the same practical zeal he brought to meetings in cities with glass walls. He had been made more human by the slow, patient work of learning how to keep his own fortune from becoming a barrier, and how to let his resources be scaffolding rather than stage lighting. On a winter evening 5 years after that random message, the three of them, Tessa, Laya, and Josh, walked home from the library under a sky the color of blue-gray tea. Laya held a book about constellations, and she pointed out a star pattern she insisted was a dragon. Tessa carried a bag with donations for the next story hour. Josh walked with his hands in his pockets and his coat collar raised. They moved like a small constancy, people who had been tested by ordinary life and had chosen to keep one another. In Westbridge, the memory of a sandwich on a library table had not become a legend. It had become something quieter and truer, a town's habit of seeing one another. The random message, sent on a whim and perhaps out of curiosity, had threaded into 5 years of deliberate attention. It had taught them all that small acts can set a trajectory, but that the direction those acts take depends wholly on the care with which others respond. If this story stayed with you, if it felt like a small bell you wanted to ring for a friend, consider subscribing for more stories about the slow work of kindness. Share this one with someone who believes in ordinary courage, a reminder that sometimes a message left at a table is the beginning of the life we choose to build together.